The tragedy of Will Price's life when he married the queen of Technicolor, Maureen O'Hara. Maureen O'Hara had the most carefully constructed image in Hollywood. She was Irish, she was Catholic, she was fiery, virtuous, and unbreakable. Audiences called her a queen. Critics called her the greatest Technicolor actress who ever lived. In 2014, the Academy handed her an honorary Oscar, and the entire room stood and applauded. She smiled, she waved. She looked exactly the way she always looked, like a woman who had done everything right, who had earned everything she had, and who had hurt no one on the way up. Before you accept that version of her story, you need to know 6 things. 1. Her first husband, a man named George Brown, proposed to her in 1939. She went through the wedding ceremony in a state of shock, flew to Hollywood the next morning, and had the marriage quietly annulled in secret while he waited for her in Ireland. She never saw him again, never sent a letter, never explained. He ceased to exist in her life the moment he stopped being useful. 2. She spent 15 years working alongside director John Ford, the man who made her a star, even after witnesses reported he had physically struck her on set. She endured it. She made 5 films with him anyway. She used him for exactly as long as she needed him, and not one day longer. 3. She was married to a man named Will Price for 11 years. He was the dialogue director who had shaped her voice and her screen presence before anyone in America knew who she was. As her career built into something Hollywood had no precedent for, his collapsed completely. When he became a liability to her image, she divorced him at the exact week The Quiet Man opened in theaters. Will Price was dead 9 years later. He was 49 years old. His obituary ran 2 sentences. Hers ran 2 pages in every major newspaper in the world. 4. While her marriage to Will Price was collapsing, she was in Ireland filming love scenes with John Wayne. Her own grandson, Connor Beau Fitzsimmons, confirmed to Closer Weekly magazine that the two did have a romance. His exact words? "I know they did at one point, but she was way too strong for him." And then he said this: "She didn't really cry when her husband died, but when Duke died, she cried." 5. After the divorce from Will Price, before she allowed herself to get close to any other man, she hired a private investigator to follow him, to verify everything he told her before she committed to anything. She refused, ever again, to be caught in a position where she did not control the information. 6. When she finally wrote her autobiography, "'Tis Herself," Will Price had already been dead for 40 years. He could not dispute a single word she wrote. In her telling, he was the permanent villain of her story. A drunk, a financial drain, a burden she had endured out of Catholic obligation. She had the last word and the only word, and she used both completely. The woman the world called the Queen of Technicolor was also one of the most calculated operators in the history of Hollywood. Not a rumor, not a reinterpretation. The evidence is in the timeline, in the court records, in the words of her own family. By the time this video is over, you will understand exactly how she built that image, and exactly who paid for it. The Foundation, Dublin, 1920. Maureen O'Hara was born Maureen Fitzsimmons on August 17, 1920, in Ranelagh, a quiet suburb just south of Dublin. She was the second of 6 children. Her father, Charles, ran a sporting goods business and held a financial stake in the Shamrock Rovers football club. He ran his household the way he ran his business, on structure, measurable output, and the understanding that results mattered far more than your feelings about the work. Her mother, Marguerite, had trained as a classical singer. Music was present in the home every day, but it was never decorative. Practice happened at fixed hours, to fixed standards, without negotiation. There was no applause for effort. The standard was either met or it was not. All 6 children were exposed to performance from early childhood, but what distinguished Maureen, what shaped everything that came later, was not talent. It was the specific kind of internal discipline that forms in a child who learns, before adolescence, that the world does not adjust itself to accommodate you. You adjust. You prepare. You perform to standard, regardless of how you feel about it that particular day. By age 6, she was training in dance and drama. By 10, she was performing in local productions. By 14, she had won a place at the Abbey Theatre, Ireland's most prestigious stage, where she studied classical repertoire under conditions that were, by every account, genuinely demanding. Here is the detail that matters for understanding everything that followed. Her father also insisted she learn typing and accounting alongside her theater training, not instead of it, alongside it. His reasoning was stated without sentiment. Performance was an unstable profession, and no child of his would build an entire life on something that could be taken from her without warning. She absorbed this. She was taught before the age of 15 that talent does not protect you, that you needed other forms of leverage, that waiting to be recognized was a luxury for people who had other options. She did not have other options, so she did not wait. She worked, she prepared, and when the opportunity came, she was ready in a way that had nothing to do with luck. London. The man who saw her, and what he took. At 17, she traveled to London for a screen test. It was a disaster. The studio dressed her wrong, lit her wrong, and sent her home convinced she had no future in film. But Charles Laughton, one of the most celebrated actors in Britain, a man whose instincts about performance were matched only by his confidence in those instincts, had watched that same screen test and noticed something no amount of poor styling could disguise. Not beauty, specifically. Presence. The particular quality of a body that had been trained to occupy space with deliberate intention. He signed her to a 7-year contract immediately, put her in Alfred Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn, then brought her to Hollywood, where she played Esmeralda in The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1939. She was 19 years old. The film earned $3 million. Critics noticed her. Studios began calling. Then Laughton sold her contract. He needed cash. Her contract had value. He sold it to RKO Pictures without consulting her, without warning, without apology. She found out when it was already a completed transaction. She later described this as the moment she felt most completely abandoned in her early career, the most unguarded admission she ever made about that period of her life. But here is what she did with that feeling. She did not confront him publicly. She did not collapse into the betrayal. She filed the lesson away with the precision of someone cataloging useful information. The specific lesson that loyalty in Hollywood was always a transaction underneath, never a commitment, and that the only reliable protection was the kind you constructed for yourself. She walked into RKO and began constructing it. John Ford. The obsession she managed for 15 years. In 1941, director John Ford arranged what amounted to a covert chemistry test between Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne. He put them in a room together, said the single word, dance, and watched while they attempted an Irish jig, Wayne stumbling through it, O'Hara executing the instruction with the composed obedience of someone who had spent a decade doing exactly that in far more demanding settings. Ford watched for a few minutes, nodded to himself, and sent them both away without explanation. He had seen what he needed to see. He had decided they would make pictures together. What followed was a professional relationship with Ford that lasted 15 years and produced 5 major films. On the surface, one of the most creatively fruitful director-actress collaborations of the post-war era. Underneath it, something considerably less presentable. Ford was obsessed with her. This was not a secret among people who worked closely with both of them. He wrote her long letters, described by those who saw them as drunken and romantic in character. He was consumed by her in a way that he could not entirely govern and, by all evidence, did not entirely try to. And on at least one documented occasion during filming, he struck her in the face. Witnesses were present. The incident was absorbed into the working dynamic and moved past. She stayed. She made 5 films with John Ford. How Green Was My Valley, Rio Grande, The Quiet Man, The Long Gray Line, The Wings of Eagles. Each one built her professional stature further. Each one added another layer to the image that was making her one of the most bankable names in the industry. She had already demonstrated at 19 that she could walk away from an impossible situation when it suited her. She had the capability to leave. She chose instead to calculate. She understood precisely what a working relationship with John Ford was worth, weighed it against precisely what it cost her, and stayed for as long as the arithmetic held. That is not victimhood. That is a specific, deliberate, and very cold form of professional intelligence. The Technicolor Throne. Between 1941 and 1953, Maureen O'Hara appeared in 19 Technicolor films, more than any other actress working in Hollywood during that period. Herbert Kalmus, the man who invented the Technicolor process, used her as his primary demonstration model when presenting the technology to studio executives. Her red hair, green eyes, the specific and exceptional way her complexion registered under the particular quality of Technicolor light. When Kalmus wanted to show the industry what his technology could do at its best, he showed them Maureen O'Hara. She was not just a star, she was a proof of concept. The Technicolor lights were brutal, high intensity, relentless, genuinely physically punishing in ways that most performers found difficult to sustain beyond a few hours. Productions built regular breaks into their schedules as a matter of standard practice. Maureen O'Hara worked for 20 hours straight without complaint. Where other actors needed recovery time, she treated the discomfort as a condition of the job and continued working. But she understood with perfect clarity what the crown was costing her beyond the physical. Studios had discovered their formula. Put O'Hara in it, dress her in green, light her with orange, and the color carries the picture regardless of the material. She later quoted studio executives using this logic to each other, her name functioning as a guarantee of visual product rather than a marker of artistic quality. She was a franchise property, and franchise properties are managed for consistency, not developed for growth. She fought quietly and persistently across those years for roles that demanded something beyond what she looked like on camera. She won those fights occasionally: Miracle on 34th Street in 1947, The Quiet Man in 1952. More often, she did not. The industry had placed her in a category, and in that era, women who stepped outside their assigned category paid for it in ways that were difficult to recover from. She had already learned this lesson from Laughton, from Ford, from the architecture of the system itself. She worked within it while building toward the point where she would have enough leverage to work around it. Will Price, the man she used to build the voice. Will Price entered Maureen O'Hara's life in 1939 on the set of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was a dialogue director from Mississippi, a man whose specific and considerable gift was hearing precisely what a performance was missing and knowing exactly how to correct it. He worked entirely behind the camera. His name never appeared on a poster. He was, in the vocabulary of the industry, a craftsman, highly skilled, genuinely valuable, and professionally invisible by design. Maureen O'Hara was 19 years old, newly arrived in Hollywood, carrying a Dublin accent that American audiences did not yet have a clear relationship with. Her instincts were strong. Her voice, in the specific technical sense that the industry required, needed work. Will Price gave her that work. They married in 1941. Through the 1940s, as her career built into something unprecedented, an actress who was also a brand, who was also the living demonstration model for an entire photographic process, Will Price made small pictures that came and went without leaving a mark. Jamboree, Stranger at Midnight, films that the industry noted and then forgot. The gap between where she was professionally and where he was became, over time, the defining fact of their marriage. Every dinner party they attended together, every premiere, every industry gathering, he was Maureen O'Hara's husband. His own name had become a footnote in a biography that was still being written. He began drinking. Seriously, then heavily, then openly, in ways that the people around them discussed in the particular quiet that surrounds problems that have not yet become public. He hired a business manager who redirected a portion of Maureen O'Hara's earnings into an account Will controlled. The routine that developed was grim in its specificity. He drank with friends at night, came home, and in the mornings, when he was incapacitated, she called an ambulance to take him to treatment. She did not help him stop. What she did, and what the timeline makes unmistakably clear, was allow the record to accumulate. The reputation that forms around a man who cannot be relied upon in a town where reliability is everything. In 1952, at the exact moment The Quiet Man opened and every film critic in America was writing her name as though it belonged on a monument, she filed for divorce. The papers ran the triumph story and the divorce story side by side. In one, she was the finest actress of her generation. In the other, she was a long-suffering woman finally free of a man who had made her life impossible. Both stories served her. One of them permanently ended Will Price. He died in 1962, 9 years after the divorce. He was 49 years old. His obituaries gave him 2 sentences and identified him primarily as Maureen O'Hara's former husband. The decade he had spent trying to rebuild from that characterization did not make the paragraph. Ireland, 1951. The 30-Year Secret. The summer of 1951. John Ford takes his production to the west coast of Ireland for The Quiet Man. Real Irish countryside, real Irish rain, real stone walls against a sky that the camera could not stop loving. And 2 of the most physically compelling human beings Hollywood had ever produced, placed together in a landscape so inherently romantic that the boundary between what was happening on camera and what was happening between takes was going to be genuinely difficult to locate. Back in Bel Air, Will Price was drinking. In the west of Ireland, his wife was filming love scenes with John Wayne. What the camera captured between them in those weeks of shooting was something John Ford, a man constitutionally resistant to sentiment he had not personally engineered, would later call the most romantic thing he had ever put on film. He was not referring to the script. He was referring to what happened between those 2 specific people when he set action. The film opened in 1952 and became a masterpiece. Audiences felt something watching O'Hara and Wayne together that they recognized as real, even if they couldn't name it precisely. The rumors started immediately. Both denied everything, firmly and without apparent discomfort. O'Hara was particularly effective. She held press conferences, gave direct denials to journalists, and in 1988 looked directly into Barbara Walters' camera and stated that she had never had a romantic relationship with John Wayne. She took out a full-page advertisement in Variety magazine, saying the same thing in print. She maintained this position for the rest of her life. But 3 pieces of evidence cannot be explained by denial. A biography of John Wayne, sourced from people who worked alongside both of them for decades, states that what began between them around the filming of The Quiet Man continued as a private, on-and-off relationship for nearly 20 years, persisting through Wayne's 3rd marriage, through O'Hara's other relationships, through 5 more films together, and 30 years of public friendship. Then there is the photograph. In the years following his separation from his 3rd wife, Pilar, John Wayne kept a photograph beside his bed. Hidden, not displayed. The subject of that photograph was Maureen O'Hara. It remained there for 30 years. He also kept 17 poems, written for her, not shared with anyone during his lifetime. A hidden photograph for 3 decades, 17 private poems. These are not behaviors that belong to a professional friendship, no matter how warm. And then there is what happened in 1979. Shortly before Wayne died of cancer, he and Maureen O'Hara spent 3 days alone together. No one else present. No record of what was said. She never disclosed it, not to journalists, not in her autobiography, not to anyone who might eventually repeat it. When Wayne died, her grandson, Connor Beau Fitzsimmons, was watching her. He later spoke to Closer Weekly magazine about what he observed. She didn't really cry when her husband died, but when Duke died, she cried. Her husband, the father of her daughter, the man whose professional reputation she had allowed to deteriorate across 11 years of marriage before using the public dissolution of that marriage to enhance her own image of suffering and survival. When Will Price died, she did not cry. John Wayne, the man she spent 30 years publicly and emphatically insisting was nothing more than a dear friend, when he died, it was the only time in her grandson's memory that he ever saw her weep. There is one final detail about Wayne that completes this picture. People who knew him well were asked in later years why he had never asked Maureen O'Hara to marry him. He had married 3 other women. He had kept her photograph by his bed for 30 years. He had written her 17 poems. The answer, from those who knew him best, was simple. Wayne only married women he believed he could manage. He knew Maureen O'Hara far too well to make that mistake. The woman who had annulled George Brown out of existence without a backward glance, who had leveraged John Ford's obsession across 15 years and 5 films, who had waited with total patience while Will Price's record built itself into something she could use, who would hire a private investigator before she allowed herself to feel anything about the next man who got close to her. That woman was not someone John Wayne was going to attempt to control. So he kept the photograph. He wrote the poems. He spent 3 days with her before he died. And he never asked. The legal weapon. In 1957, Confidential magazine, the most feared tabloid in Hollywood, a publication that had terrorized the industry for years by running on fabricated details and informant tips, ran a story about Maureen O'Hara. Most stars targeted by Confidential stayed silent. The calculation was standard. A lawsuit draws more attention to the story than the story itself. Silence was considered the rational response. Maureen O'Hara took them to court. She presented her case with the precision of someone who understood how information functions as a weapon, and how to dismantle it in a formal legal setting. She proved her innocence using passport records showing she was abroad, filming at the time the alleged incident was supposed to have occurred. She won. Her action was part of a series of legal challenges that collectively damaged Confidential severely enough that it never recovered as a publication. She did not simply defend herself. She destroyed the institution that had attacked her through channels that were entirely legitimate, entirely documented, and entirely a matter of public record. There was nothing anyone could complain about. The method was impeccable. This is the consistent pattern across her life. When something needed to be removed, she removed it, through means that left her completely clean. She never had dirty hands. She never needed to. The private investigator after Will Price. After the divorce and the press campaign that had positioned her as a woman finally free of a difficult situation, she allowed herself to meet someone new, Enrique Parra, a prominent Mexican banker and politician. His own wealth, no professional need for anything she represented, genuinely drawn to her without calculation. She fell for him. And then, before she allowed that feeling to develop into anything with real consequences, she hired a private investigator. Parra had told her he was separated from his wife. She needed it confirmed, not because she doubted him specifically, but because she had already learned across 2 decades and multiple experiences of being surprised by people she had trusted at their word. what the cost of that trust could be. She ran the investigation. The results satisfied her. She allowed the relationship to continue. It lasted 15 years, ending when Parra's daughter died in 1967, and his grief took him somewhere she couldn't follow. She did not chase him. She had learned by then that chasing people was a position of disadvantage. She did not place herself in positions of disadvantage. The autobiography, The Last Word, written alone. Tis Herself was published in 2004. Maureen O'Hara was 84 years old. Will Price had been dead for 42 years. In its pages, she wrote their marriage in terms that left no ambiguity about which of them bore responsibility for its failure. He was a drinker. He was financially reckless with her money. He was unreliable. He was a burden she had endured for a decade out of Catholic duty and practical necessity. The marriage was a mistake from its beginning, and its end had been nothing but overdue relief. This is the account that exists in libraries. This is what any researcher, journalist, or future biographer will find when they search the name Will Price. There is no second document. No surviving interview in which Will Price offered his version. No memoir, no archive, no recorded conversation in which he was permitted to say, "Here is what those 11 years looked like from where I was standing." He died in 1962, before the era of the recorded oral history, before anyone thought to put a microphone in front of him and ask. The only written account of their marriage is the one Maureen O'Hara wrote when he was no longer alive to answer it. She chose her words carefully. They have lasted completely unchallenged. What she was. Maureen O'Hara died on October 24th, 2015. She was 95 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep in Boise, Idaho, near the family she had outlasted almost everyone else to be close to. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, beside her third husband, Charles Blair, the pilot she had been genuinely happy with, the man who died in a plane crash in 1978 and left a space she never fully closed. She was not buried beside Will Price. She was survived by her daughter Bronwyn. Bronwyn Price, Will Price's daughter. The woman who spent her career playing characters defined by fierce loyalty and uncompromising moral clarity was, in the life she actually lived, something considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. Someone who understood that loyalty and moral clarity are performances, brands, not necessarily lived realities, and that the distance between the image and the reality can be managed indefinitely if you are disciplined enough, patient enough, and willing to do what is necessary without ever announcing that you are doing it. Was she wrong to protect herself in a system architecturally designed to consume women and discard them when their commercial value declined? No. Was she wrong to be ambitious in an industry that punished ambition in women at every turn? No. Was she wrong to survive when survival required the kind of decisions that left other people holding the cost? That question is harder. George Brown, waiting in London for a wife who had already legally stopped being his. Charles Laughton, who taught her what betrayal without warning felt like, and thereby taught her how to perform loyalty without ever fully committing to it. John Ford, whose obsession she leveraged across 15 years of films while giving him nothing in return that she hadn't calculated first. Will Price, dying at 49 with 2 sentences in the paper, and a reputation permanently shaped by the woman who outlived him by 53 years and wrote the only surviving account of their marriage. John Wayne, carrying a photograph hidden beside his bed for 3 decades because he understood, better than anyone, perhaps because he knew her better than anyone, that asking her to stay was a question she would answer on her own terms, or not at all. The standing ovation in 2014 was for the performance. The honorary Oscar was for the career. This story is for the person underneath both of them. The Queen of Technicolor was real. The films were real. The craft was genuine, and the longevity was earned. But the image, the Irish Catholic woman of impeccable virtue, the long-suffering wife, the loyal friend, the woman who only ever cried for John Wayne, that was the most sustained, most technically precise, and most completely controlled performance of her entire career. She performed it for 95 years, for an audience of hundreds of millions of people, without a script, without a director, and without ever once breaking character. If that is not the work of the greatest actress of her generation, it is at the very least the work of an extraordinary woman who understood, from childhood in a Dublin suburb, that the world does not arrange itself in your favor. And she made sure it arranged itself in hers.